They're pointing to me. Good morning. Are we going to start with the music? The first. When we light our chalice this morning, we remember and honor the Unitarians who lit a chalice in their windows as a sign of refuge and safety for people fleeing persecution and death at the hands of European fascists 80 years ago. In the same spirit, we light this chalice as a sign of refuge and safety for those fleeing persecution and death in America today. Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Lincoln this Sunday morning. My name is Charlie Ahern, and I am joined today by Dr. Margaret Jacobs, who will be our speaker. Over the last several years, the way we have met has often changed, but whether in person, on Zoom, on a YouTube live stream, or some way of being that we cannot yet imagine, worship together is a change to deepen our connection with the sources of meaning in our lives and to proclaim who we are and what we are about. Throwing open the doors of the congregation and proclaiming the radical love and welcome that is the heart of our faith. The Unitarian Church of Lincoln aspires to be a loving community, uniting reason with spiritual exploration to transform ourselves and the world. Welcome to this loving community. May we, in our gathering here, be about the work of transforming ourselves and the world. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jacobs. Margaret Jacobs is the Charles Mach Professor of History and the Director of the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is of settler background and collaborates with Rosebud Lakota journalist Kevin Aburesk on Reconciliation Rising, a multimedia project that showcases Indigenous people and settlers who are working together to honestly confront painful and traumatic histories, promote meaningful and respectful dialogue between natives and non-natives, and create pathways to reconciliation. Through Reconciliation Rising, Kevin and Margaret have produced a podcast and an 11-minute film, Return of the Pawnees. They are working on an hour-long documentary, The Land Returns. Margaret is also a co-founder and co-director of the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project at UNL. This project locates and makes available all the government records related to the Genoa School as an act of archival reconciliation, of bringing history home to tribal nations. The project aims to support descendant communities in telling more complete stories of Genoa and to promote awareness and truth-seeking about the boarding schools among all Americans. Margaret has published more than 35 articles and 4 books, primarily about the U.S. government's policy and practice of indigenous child removal and family separation over a century. She published After 100 Winters in Search of Reconciliation on America's Stolen Lands with Princeton University Press in 2021. Welcome, Dr. Jacobs. And so I decided today we would sing simple hymns. I didn't want Bill to have to rehearse too much. So we're going to start with hymn 361, Enter, Rejoice, and Come In. Please rise as you are able. And now we're going to have the Time for All Ages, and Linda Brown will read for us. So,
Would the children like to come forward? I asked Cora if I should read from the pulpit or read down on the floor like Chelsea, so the kids came forward. And Cora said, read down here. special story today called Stolen Words. And it's written by, do you need a little, should we bring the volume up just a little bit? How's that?
Good.
Okay, how's that? Great. Our book today is called Stolen Words, and it's written by a woman who is a descendant of the Cree Nation, the Cree people. I'm not sure if they're a nation or not. I'm learning here. But she wished that she had had this conversation with her grandfather and has written it out for us with pictures. A bad thing happened to many of the grandfathers of the Cree people. They were taken away, I would say on good faith, they were taken away to schools where they could not speak their native languages. And in fact, they were beaten. They were punished if they spoke their native words. And lots of times they didn't get to see their families. So the idea of taking the Indian children into these schools, that it would help them assimilate into the white culture that was the settler culture that was coming into our nation, didn't maybe work as well as we thought. But let me go forth with the story. This story is written by Melanie Florence and illustrated by Gabrielle Grimard. She came home from school today, skipping and dancing, humming a song under her breath, clutching a dream catcher she had made from odds and ends, bits of string, plastic beads, and brightly colored feathers. Her glossy braids danced against her shoulders, swaying with her, black as raven's wing. "Grandpa," she asked, clutching his hand, spinning under his arm before dropping it again, "how do you say grandfather in Cree?" He stopped breathing for a moment. A lifetime to a 7-year-old. He looked down at her sadly. "I don't remember," he answered. "I lost my words a long time ago." A frown clouded her face. "How do you lose words, Grandpa?" she asked. "They took them away," he answered. She thought for a moment. "Where did they take them?" she asked. "Where they took all of us, away from home, away from laughter and soft words, away from our mothers who cried for us." She reached for his gnarled hand. "Who took you away, Grandpa?" she asked quietly. "Men and women dressed in black, talking to us with words we did not know," he answered. They reached home and sat on the steps together. "Where did they take you, Grandpa?" she asked. "Away to a school that was cold and lonely, where angry white faces raised their voices and their hands when we used our words," he answered. "They took our words and locked them away, punished us until we forgot them, until we sounded like them. Harsh, sharp words, so different from the sounds of our beautiful ones." She touched his weathered face, tried to wipe the sadness away with her soft hands. She looked down in her lap and handed him the dream catcher that she had made for her room. "You take this, Grandpa," she said. "Maybe it will help you find your words again." He smiled at her, his granddaughter, and touched her innocent face. a face that had never known hard words or raised hands. He smiled and kissed her head. The next day, she skipped out of school again, smiling widely at her grandfather. She stopped in front of him and took a deep breath. "Dancy, Nemusum," she said. His eyes widened. She smiled brighter than the sun. "I found your words, Grandpa," she said. She pulled a tattered, well-worn paperback out of her book bag. "Introduction to Cree," it said. "My teacher helped me find this for you at the library." He reached for it, his hand shaking, opened it, feeling the soft, much-loved pages under his fingers. "Nosum," he whispered, "granddaughter." The word felt familiar in his mouth. It felt like his home, his mother. He turned the pages of the book carefully. "Miss Nom Egan, book." He turned another page. Word after word, Pikeswewin, language, his words, pages and pages of them. "Thank you, Tinky." "Will you read to me?" she asked, taking his hand in hers and leading him home. "Will you teach me your words?" His heart danced as he nodded, holding the book against his chest. And that is the end of our story.
Now, I guess everybody can go back, or the classrooms, young and old. A central part of our services is the time when we join together as a community to mark the moments of our lives. We share with one another our joys, our sorrows, the events that mark the steps on our journey. The threads of sorrow and those of joy are intertwined in the fabric of our lives, present for all, remembered by all. We share those threads, and then they are woven together with those of others in our community. Our joys are shared and magnified. We are comforted in our sorrows. I invite you to type into the chat or speak into this shared space your name or the name of another you wish to be remembered in sorrow.
Mary and Marcus and Bear. Family who all have COVID with 2 new baby girls.
Mm.
Clarence. Great. Our grandson Titan who has COVID. Eric, my cousin, who's in hospice with brain cancer. Mark, my son with cancer. Alan Worth has COVID.
Can you repeat them on the mic?
I'm sorry, Alan Worth
Has COVID.
has COVID. I'm sorry, I haven't been watching the chat. Has anybody been checking the chat? Oscar?
Nothing else.
Okay.
Concern to Alan as he recovers from COVID.
Excuse me?
Concern to Alan as he recovers from COVID.
Concern for Alan as he recovers from COVID. I invite you now to type into the chat or speak into this shared space your name or the name of another you wish to be remembered in joy, and I will repeat names as people speak them.
Laura Weymouth, who's now returned from the hospital back to our assisted living.
Okay, Laura Weymouth, who has returned from the hospital and is back in assisted living.
Yes, where she is?
Legacy Estates.
Okay, thank you.
So she's at Legacy Estates.
Squash are coming in and watermelon.
Squash and watermelon are coming in,
Tomatoes right behind.
and the tomatoes are right behind.
Three quarts of gooseberries, a legacy from our moved out of state member, K.K. Munson.
Oh, wow.
Okay. 3 quarts of gooseberries.
A legacy.
A legacy of K.K. Munson. Who,
Bingo.
that's good, okay.
One,
Oh,
Jamie Radcliffe says Wendy is feeling better.
good, okay. Jamie Radcliffe said that Wendy is feeling better. That's a good sign, good thing. Jean is back. Wendy. Okay. Okay. So now let's join me in another simple hymn. Number 188. Come, come, whoever you are. Please. Oh, this is a round. And so I'm going to attempt to lead around group 1, 2, 3, 4. And this may get chaotic. Unless somebody is a better. Is there someone else who would help me? Oh, please, please. Okay.
I will lead you in with 8 measures. We will all sing the song together. And then break up? At first. And then we will start over there with number 1. Okay? Okay. Hey, thank you to Jason and Stacy. Now Oscar.
So we have an additional joy to talk about this morning, and that is that the Baltimore Orioles have won 7 games in a row for the first time since 2017.
They beat Shohei Ohtani again last
No, that is a joy, but it is not the joy. This joy actually begins with somewhat of a sorrow. Kelly Ross is leaving her staff position with us on July 15th, which means this is her last Sunday here. Now, some of you may know Kelly as the public face of this congregation over the last 2.5 years, as she's been our member and admin coordinator. Kelly has also been the behind-the-scenes face of the Unitarian Church of Lincoln since probably the first week of the pandemic, when she started video editing, being the person on the phone, helping with Zoom, being the person in the office, talking the rest of us down any number of times. It is a true honor to have worked with you, and I am so excited for what comes next with you. And this will be a place to come back to anytime. There will always be a place at the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. So thank you so much.
You're okay.
And sorrow is mingled with joy. Because while Kelly is stepping away to do some big things, we have 2 people taking her role, because that's the only way to make it work. So many of you probably know the 2 people in front of me, but in case you don't, I would like to introduce Wendy Hesterman as our new administrative associate. She'll be working in the office with Jean. And Liz Bonnie Heerman as our new membership manager, who will be working with me on the new member classes and the front of house stuff on Sunday morning. We are really excited to bring them on. It was an exciting moment as we were hiring, as Kelly and I looked at each other the other week and went, oh my. This is going to be fun the next couple of years. So welcome to both of you. We are so excited to have you joining us in this role. Yes. So if we could give them a round of applause too.
Off we go.
All right. And with that, I'm not sure where we are in the service, but I will turn the service back over to Charlie. There we go, for the offering.
Yes. Now, hopefully Oscar didn't walk away with what I have to read here. Okay.
Frisky.
Now, I had a reading that I wanted to share before I do the standard script. This is by Branduk Lovely. Let there be an offering to sustain and strengthen this place, which is sacred to so many of us, a community of memory and of hope, for we are now the keepers of the dream. Each week we take up a collection to support the work of this church and our partners in the community. We do this because just as we all grow from our participation in this community, we all give back through our time, our talent, and our treasure. To give, you can text UCL or UC Lincoln and the amount to 73256. That's UC Lincoln and the amount to 73256. The offering will now be gratefully received.
there's different drum groups. There's traditional drum groups, there's social drum groups, and there's competitive drum groups that go out and compete at the various powwows for prize money. Some of us do that regularly, go out and compete.
Good morning, everybody. It's so great to see you, and it's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored and delighted to be here.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the book I recently published. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity because I think my talk later will make a little bit more sense after you've heard a little bit of this. So this is from the intro. June 10th, 2018. It's a typical summer day in Nebraska. Hot, humid, and hazy. An insistent wind blows the heat around like a convection oven. We are on a farm, and yes, there will be corn. The farmers, Art and Helen Tanderup, are white and in their 60s. Art is portly, a bit aloof, and gruff. Helen exudes stand by your man farm wife and tough as nails, take no crap rural woman. This farm has been in Helen's family ever since the late 19th century, pioneering days. If you are imagining a 2-story clapboard farmhouse circa 1900 with a big porch surrounded by a tangle of rose bushes, dignified old shade trees, and a generous circle of grass, you'd be right. Art is preparing to plant corn in his field near Neely in north central Nebraska. Helen is working the kitchen. But the tractor remains in the barn, and the big sacks of field corn, the kernels all the same size and all the same weak yellow color, sit unopened in the utility shed. Art won't be planting those today. Instead, about 100 people are slowly gathering to help. Art sows something else on his land, and by hand. They come bearing small, beaded bags of seeds. Poured out in your palm, they are dusty blue, pomegranate red, with some cream and butter thrown in. These sowers have also brought tubs of potato salad and coleslaw, hefty watermelons, and still warm pies, and many are pitching in to help Helen serve the large crowd. Perhaps you think it's a neighborly barn raising, a return to the homesteading era. Maybe you feel a little nostalgic just thinking about it if you're from a farm family or if your childhood diet of pop culture was filled with such scenes, as mine was. But this isn't a reunion of pioneer families. Many of the visitors are members of the Ponca tribe, separated by federal fiat into northern Nebraska and southern Oklahoma branches for over 135 years. Indians from other nearby tribes, the Omahas, Winnebagos, and Santee Sioux, also have come to the gathering. They ride up to the Tanderup's farm in fully decked out pickups. They tumble out of their trucks, laughing, in shorts, jeans, and flip-flops. Some of the women dress in handmade calico skirts ringed with ribbons. Some sport hand-beaded accessories. There are non-Indians, too, in their baseball caps and cargo shorts, their Birkenstocks and sneakers. Kids turn cartwheels on the grass. Their grandparents lounge in folding chairs near the big utility shed where the food will be served. It's clear from the hugs and the smiles, the comfortable ease, that many of these people have known each other for a while. Indeed, these modern and these ancient corn planters had originally come together in 2013 to oppose a transnational oil pipeline, the Keystone XL, that would bisect the Tanderup's farm and the homelands of the Poncas. So I'm going to cut a little bit here, and the interim talks about how the Poncas, the Santee, the Winnebagos, the Omahas, and many Lakota peoples too have been working together with the Tanderups and other non-Indian families in the area to oppose the pipeline, but that also they came up with the idea that the Poncas would like to plant some of their ancient corn on the Tanderup's land. So they started doing this, and they've been doing it now in 2018 when I wrote this. They'd been doing it for 5 years. This 5th year of Ponca corn planting at the Tanderup farm is special. Before the planting begins, a ceremony is held. 4 VIPs sit in front of a large table covered with a bison robe. Art Tanderup sits on one end. Larry Wright Jr., the chairman of the Northern Ponca tribe, is seated on the other. Helen Tanderup nestles cozily between her husband and Casey Camp Horonek, a councilwoman of the Southern Ponca tribe of Oklahoma. Almost exactly 160 years ago, Ponca chiefs had signed over millions of acres of their homelands to the U.S. government, later to be redistributed as homesteads to the people like Helen Tanderup's family. Today on this topsy-turvy farm, instead of the Poncas giving up more of their land, Art and Helen Tanderup are signing a different kind of treaty, a deed that returns the Poncas' 10-acre corn plot to them. During the ceremony, Art talks about how the Tanderup's return of the land grew out of facing the Poncas' history together at the spirit camp they had established. This day on the farm has been many years in the making, Art says. We remember Mika C. Horonek talking about such an action several years ago when we sat in that teepee at the Ponca Trail of Tears camp. We talked about bringing the corn back to its homeland. We talked about the homeland being taken away from the people. We talked about growing that corn again and making all the relatives healthy. We talked about how it would be great to have some of the homeland back again. Art acknowledges, too, that the Tanderup's return of 10 acres to the Poncas is one modest step toward making amends for the history that dispossessed and divided the Poncas. It's an honor for me and Helen to make this happen, he says, and to give a small piece of what was theirs and so terribly taken away. Such a tragedy in our American history, and then to have to be driven away from this land that was taken from them. So this is just a small gesture. It can never make what went wrong right, but it can show how we feel about this and how we are honored to give this small piece of land back to the people that were the stewards of this land. They took care of it. They knew how to take care of it. After he speaks, Art signs the deed to transfer the land to the Poncas and then passes it to Helen, who quietly but decisively adds her signature. The onlookers clap their hands. Casey Camp Horonek and Larry Wright Jr. wipe tears away from their eyes. Casey is to speak next, but she's overcome with emotion, and she bows her head on Larry's shoulder. Helen comforts her. After a few moments, Casey composes herself and says, "This day our Mother the Earth sustained us and gave us reason to live. This day the wind is blessing us, allowing us to become one in spirit." It is clear Casey is thinking of her relatives and their painful experiences. She offers my deepest, sincerest prayers to the ancestors of my people and breaks down again. Referring to those standing behind her, she says, "My children back here, they're all named for those who walk this very trail you're standing on. And when we call their names, we're calling those spirits. They're here with us." Casey then signs the deed to great applause, and she hands it to Larry to sign. Larry tells of how pleased he is to be with our friends, our relatives, to be here as part of this historic day. For Art and Helen and their family to be willing to do this says a lot of them. He continues, "This means a lot, to be able to sit here as partners, to come together out of the goodness of your heart and undo what the federal government did. The federal government separated our Ponca people into 2 different governments, but Art and his family have brought our nations back together to unite us with this land." Larry adds that the Ponca tribe of Nebraska is buying 1,800 acres of land near Niobrara. "One day we'll plant Ponca corn there," he says. The Poncas then honor Art and Helen by draping Pendleton blankets woven with colorful geometric designs over their shoulders. The couple accept the gift gratefully, even as the sweat rolls down their faces on this summer day. It is not often that settlers learn about the specific piece of land they occupy and of how indigenous people were dispossessed and displaced from it. It is rare, too, that indigenous people have the opportunity to meet and share their history with the descendants of the settlers who displaced them. The Tandurups came to know the truth of the place where they had settled. The Poncas gently offered this truth to them as a kind of gift. It is even more unusual for settlers to take some responsibility for this truth, and rarer still to take action to make amends for it. The Tandurups are uncommon settlers indeed. But I don't tell you this story to lionize the Tandurups as white saviors who took pity on the Poncas and gave them a small donation of land. I'm relating what the Tandurups did because they show us what can happen when settlers and indigenous people face their painful truths together, plant new seeds of friendship, uncover paths to reconciliation and redress, and imagine new futures. They show us other possibilities of how we can hold unsettling knowledge within us and learn to live together on this haunted land. Thanks.
Please join me in hymn 170, We Are Gentle, Angry People. Please rise as you are able.
that song really takes me back to my college years when Holly Near was at her peak. And so that's a wonderful song to start us with what I wanted to tell you today. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting today on the past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee people, the Otoe-Missouri, Omaha, and Kansa peoples. The Salt Basin around present-day Lincoln attracted many indigenous nations to this region. The Omaha called the area Niskite, which means salt water, and their women used eagle feathers to collect the salt, which they then used to cure buffalo meat. Under pressure from federal officials and settlers, the Otoe-Missouri ceded this land that became Lincoln to the federal government in 1833 and 1854, and this forced out the tribal peoples who had called the Niskite home for many generations. Native peoples of many nations live in Lincoln today and contribute to our community's vitality and diversity, and today I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. I also want to thank my dear friend and colleague Kevin Abrusk, who researched and wrote this land acknowledgement, and I know he's going to be with you next Sunday. And before I get further in, I also want to explain a term I use to refer both to myself and other non-native people. I use the term settler. I use this term because I think it's one part of facing up to our history to acknowledge that the United States is a settler colonial nation, like Australia and like Canada. In those two nations, the term settler colonialism is widely used and accepted. And it refers to a form of foreign intervention that seeks to transfer vast amounts of indigenous land to incoming colonizers. In that process, settler colonialism aimed to eliminate indigenous people physically, politically, and culturally, and replace them with colonizers who've come to stay. Many settlers today believe that they had nothing to do with the dispossession or the historical abuses of indigenous people in the United States. And that it's pretty true. Neither you nor I participated in these atrocities, but all of us who are settlers have benefited enormously from indigenous land, and we still do, even if we had no direct hand in removing indigenous people from it. It will be difficult to heal from the past and move toward reconciliation until we acknowledge this basic fact. So I regularly use the term settler for myself and for those of us who are non-native. Now I want to take you around the globe and back in time. And I want to talk about apologies. Australia, February 2008. Kevin Rudd is the newly elected Prime Minister of Australia. For his first official act of office, he delivered an important address before Parliament. He said, "We apologize for the removal of Indigenous children from their families, their communities, and their country, for the pain, suffering, and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants, and their families left behind. We say sorry." Thousands of Australians, both Indigenous and settler, traveled to the capital, Canberra, and lined up outside Parliament House to watch the event. The apology was also broadcast live around the nation, and most communities planned events to accompany it. The day of the apology was momentous. Australians remember where they were that day, like many Americans recall where we were when we first heard of 9/11. Canada, June 2008. A few months later, Prime Minister Stephen Harper of Canada delivered an apology to the survivors of Canada's Indian residential schools. As in Australia, there was practically a national holiday so that Canadian citizens could view the apology at one of 30 major events across the nation. The United States, 2009. Following suit, President Barack Obama signed a Native American apology resolution into law. Do you remember where you were when Obama apologized to Indigenous people in the United States? Yeah. Does anybody remember this? Well, you can be forgiven. You didn't miss this. It was almost invisible. The apology was buried in the 2010 Defense Appropriations Act. The White House did not hold a press conference. They did not invite the press. They did not invite any Native American representatives to be there when the apology was delivered or when the president signed it. And the apology was very vague. It, quote, apologized on behalf of the United States to all Native peoples for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect of Native peoples by citizens of the United States. So unfortunately, this apology has not brought any kind of healing to the United States. Instead, we have mostly silence, ignorance, and denial when it comes to the abuses that Indigenous people have suffered. Canada followed its apology with a 6-year Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or I'll call it a TRC for short. And I had written about Indian boarding schools and their counterparts in Australia and Canada for almost 2 decades. So I decided I wanted to attend the TRC's final ceremony in Ottawa in June 2015. The TRC had gathered testimony from Indigenous people who, as small children, had been separated from their families and forced to attend Indian residential schools, just like the story that Linda read to the children here. These are the schools which you might have heard of in the last year at which unmarked graves, mass unmarked graves, have been found. So on the morning of June 1st, 2015, I walked briskly. It was very cold still in Ottawa. I walked briskly from my shabby Airbnb to the Delta Ottawa Hotel. I joined thousands of people as they crowded into the hotel's ballroom. Some were of settler background, but most attendees were Indigenous. 3 drummers surrounded and pounded a large floor drum as the 3 distinguished TRC commissioners paraded onto the stage. Commissioner Murray Sinclair opened the event. Of Ojibwe or Anishinaabe heritage, he'd become the first Indigenous judge in the province of Manitoba. He asked all the survivors in the audience to stand. And these are survivors of the Indian residential schools. I happened to be seated next to 3 elderly men and women who solemnly rose from their seats, along with many hundreds more. It was really moving just to be seated near them. Sinclair honored the courage of the survivors, acknowledging that sometimes it had been the first time that you've told your stories. The crowd stomped their feet in unison and thundered their applause, and many people wept. Then Murray Sinclair declared that the findings of the TRC about the abuses of the residential schools were not an Indigenous problem, but a Canadian problem. Canada, he said, had sought to erase from the face of the earth the history and culture of its Indigenous peoples. Sinclair spoke to both in-person attendees and viewers at home. We ask you to learn, to share, and to reflect on this tragic part of Canadian history. But more than that, we ask you to act. The next day, to much fanfare, the TRC planned to release its final report. I got to the hotel an hour early, but the ballroom was already completely full. So I followed a crowd on the escalators up to a room on the 3rd floor to watch the proceedings on TV. Commissioner Wilton Littlechild told how he had been brought at the age of 6 from the home of his Cree grandparents to spend the next 14 years at Indian residential schools. We were abused for using our languages and practicing our spirituality, he told us. We learned that more than 1/3 of survivors had experienced sexual abuse in the schools. In one video clip, one residential school survivor described having to lick the floor as punishment. Another was forced to see a child eat her own vomit as punishment. And those of us who watched this broadcast together in the small room were all really weighed down by the magnitude of the cruelty. We collectively grieved for the sufferings of Indigenous children and families from whom they'd been separated. But in this small room, for all the sadness, there was another shared emotion that pervaded the room. A potent kinship formed among us, even though many of us were strangers. It felt like a deep connectedness, a desire to care for one another and do better. We were witnessing a momentous occasion, a nation remembering and taking responsibility for its past abuses. and each of us personally was being called to tap into our deepest humanity. In a world of cynicism, it was surprising to experience this moment of pure possibility. We glimpsed how we might all heal together from the historical wounds we had suffered or inflicted, and if we could just polish these moments like tiny beads and string them into a long necklace. So Ottawa did not just represent a national moment of reckoning. It also engendered for me a personal reckoning. It really changed me as a scholar and as a person. From that moment on, I've asked, how can the work I do as a settler historian, as a settler person, help other people come to terms with the traumas of our past and develop respectful ways of relating to each other? I realize that I have a responsibility to use whatever skills, resources, platforms I have to serve the cause of truth and reconciliation. So that's when I started writing After 100 Winters. At first, I wanted to explore the disparity in how Australia, Canada, and the US were reckoning with their histories of Indigenous child removal and family separation. And at the time, I had a really clunky title. It was called, Does the US Need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And luckily, one of my Navajo friends told me, Margaret, that's a horrible title. So it was going to be a book that looked at big national truth and reconciliation processes in Canada and Australia, like the apologies I just told you about, and the lack of action in the United States. But several things happened to take the project and me in a very different direction. First, I started out the project very starry-eyed about what a TRC could do. I thought the US could and should emulate Canada and Australia. But then I interviewed many people in those nations about the TRCs, both Indigenous and settlers, and I read as much as I could about them. And I learned that these redress efforts that had occurred in Canada and Australia, for sure they've been a step in the right direction, and they've brought greater attention to settler colonial wrongs and Indigenous rights. But sadly, they haven't brought a lot of healing and satisfaction to Indigenous people. And so this led me to ponder what had gone awry there and what the United States might actually learn from some of the limitations of these TRCs. I wanted, too, to explore what would truly bring healing and justice to Indigenous peoples in the United States and how this would transform American society in the process. Now, I don't have any set answers for you. So the subtitle of my book is not How to Achieve Reconciliation in 5 Easy Steps. You know, it's not that. It's In Search of Reconciliation, because that's sort of the spirit I believe that we all need to take, is that this is an ongoing process and a practice. And there's no set formula. There's no checklist. There's no guidebook. So I decided early on that I wanted to interview all sorts of people who were involved in truth and reconciliation efforts. This included people like Murray Sinclair, and what a joy it was to interview him. But it also included people like the Tanderups, and what a joy it was to interview them. I also decided that I wanted to make these interviews widely available, and that I wanted to conduct them in the spirit of truth and reconciliation itself. So I thought, you know, I'd really like to partner with an Indigenous person who has similar interests and passions. So I approached Rosebud Lakota journalist Kevin Aberesk in town. We didn't know each other at all, but we'd been brought together by a mutual friend. And luckily, Kevin was very interested in this as well. And so we started a project in 2018 that we've come to call Reconciliation Rising. And as Charlie mentioned in his introduction, it's a multimedia project, a podcast, a website, films, that showcases Indigenous people and settlers who are working together to confront the past and then create pathways to reconciliation. Our interviews made me realize that much more was going on in the United States than I had thought, but that most of us don't know anything about it. And that was part of the reason we wanted to do this project, is we wanted to bring attention to and showcase these efforts. I also learned so much from all the people we've been interviewing. They provide incredible models for working toward truth and reconciliation, and that's why I was glad I got to read about the Tanderups, because I find that they're such an incredible model. So I wanted to leave you with sharing just a couple of the things I've learned along the way of doing this. As I mentioned, I started out this project thinking about these big national efforts. But I was really inspired by many of the people I met, including Paula Palmer in Boulder, Colorado, who's a settler who works very closely with an indigenous woman named Geraldine Dakota. And Paula, explained to me, and many others explained to me, how important it is for us who are settlers to start where we are, to become really deeply familiar with the places that we occupy, and to learn how the land passed from the hands of indigenous peoples to settlers. And this is an ongoing process for me. I am currently really want to learn more about the Oto-Missouria and their backgrounds, their experiences, and how the land passed from their hands to Lincoln and the university. Another thing I've come to really strongly believe is that acknowledging the abuses and injustices against indigenous people and then working to repair them is a key task of building a truly pluralistic and democratic society. So if that's something you all care about, and I'm absolutely certain that you do, that I think that this is not just a peripheral, marginal thing. It's key to building a democratic society, because indigenous peoples were never consulted. They never gave their consent to so many things that happened against them, and that's still happening today. Just the most recent Supreme Court decision that came down was another example of this, and there's another big Supreme Court coming up next year around indigenous issues. And the third thing I've really learned is that these truth and reconciliation efforts need to be led by indigenous people. And of course, indigenous people have a lot of diverse perspectives and approaches, and they don't all agree. And not all of them will want to engage in this. Many of them, and understandably, are mistrustful, or they have other agenda items or other things that are of importance to them. But some indigenous people will want to work on this. We settlers need to take a backseat role, a supportive role, a partnership, collaborative role, not a leading role. And we can learn a lot from the cautionary tale of the Friends of the Indians of the 19th century. This was a group of very influential settlers, many of whom took up the cause of American Indians after fighting to abolish slavery. At first, they supported American Indian treaty rights and land restitution, but soon they turned to promoting cultural assimilation through boarding schools. And then they turned to the allotment of communally held lands to individual Indians. And these two policies proved so enormously damaging and traumatic to Indian people. Indian people lost 90 million more acres of land. Many lost their languages through the boarding schools. But the Friends of the Indians who promoted this thought they knew what was best for Indians. So I explore this as a cautionary tale so that we today don't repeat this, so that we always work in collaboration with and under the guidance and leadership of indigenous people. Another thing I've learned, and I think this is key to why things haven't worked out so well in Australia or Canada yet, is that truth and reconciliation efforts need to address the foundational crime that occurred against indigenous peoples. And that foundational crime is the theft of land. And from that, all sorts of other abuses occurred. So if we want to atone for what happened in the past, we really have to take land restitution seriously. And we don't have time today to talk about what that would mean, but I'd love to talk with you more about it someday.
Stay for coffee.
Thank you. And And finally, or maybe not finally, I've got two more points. Truth and reconciliation efforts probably will provide the greatest healing if they're carried out at the grassroots level and at the local level rather than at the big national level. And it's not that we don't need them at the national level or at our state level, but for Indigenous peoples, when you think about it, they never saw themselves as part of a big, huge, massive group of people. They see themselves as Pawnees, as Poncas, as Otos, and they want to reconnect with the places that they're from and to reconnect with the people who live there now, the settlers who live there now. So you see that with the Poncas and the Tandurups. You see that with the Pawnee people and Roger Welsh, who gave back 60 acres of land to them, and something else I talk about in the book. But you see it too in institutions, churches, universities where I work, corporations and nonprofit organizations, especially environmental organizations, are all places where we can work on these issues. I'm a big believer in that, and I also, and this is the final point, that settlers need not fear this process of confronting the truth and working for reconciliation. I think many of us think, oh, I'm going to be shamed. I'm going to be humiliated. People are going to be angry with me. People are going to accuse me and blame me. But that's usually, yes, you're going to hear the stories and you might feel uncomfortable. But in general, every person that Kevin and I have interviewed, the Tandurups, Roger Welsh, and many others, they never talk about how ashamed they feel or humiliated they feel. They always talk about the deep and rewarding relationships that they've developed with Indigenous peoples. So I have discovered that becoming accountable and taking responsibility for the past is empowering and liberating. And so that's what I want to leave you with today. And I just really want to thank you for being so attentive, and it's just a real pleasure to meet all of you too, and I do look forward to staying for coffee. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like you to join me in a responsive reading. Number 576, I think it should be up on the screen, hopefully. A Litany of Restoration by Marjorie Bowens Wheatley. And I will begin, and then I think the response is in bold. Okay. If recognizing the interdependence of all life, we strive to build community, the strength we gather will be our salvation. If you are black and I am white, it will not matter. If you are female and I am male, it will not matter. If you are older and I am younger, it will not matter. If you are progressive and I am conservative, it will not matter. If you are straight and I am gay, if you are Christian and I am Jewish, it will not matter. If we join spirits as brothers and sisters, the pain of our aloneness will be lessened, and that does matter. In the Spirit, we build community and move toward restoration. And I have some closing words. These are my favorite closing words. If here you have found freedom, take it with you into the world. If you have found comfort, go and share it with others. If you have dreamed dreams, help one another that they may come true. If you have known love, give some back to a bruised and hurting world. Go in peace. I think there's another song. Okay.